Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you are here. Before we start, I just want to do a little housekeeping for our in-person attendees. Just remember to silence your phone, limit talking during the presentations. If you have any questions for the presenters, please wait till they're done, and we'll have a Q&A after each presentation. And bathrooms are located in the lobby, but down one floor, so that you'll see a stairwell. They're right down there. For our virtual attendees, you will have noticed that your camera is disabled and your microphone is muted. And if you have any questions for the presenters, please use your question tab, and we will forward those to the presenters at the end of their presentation. So let's get things started. I'd like to introduce Richard Rand, our Associate Director of Collections here at the Getty Museum.
Thank you, BJ, and welcome everyone. I can sort of see you. It looks like a pretty good full house. Good morning and welcome to the 8th International Mountmakers Forum. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. Getty recognizes and is committed to undertaking the work to build relationships with these communities. Thank you. Delighted to kick off these proceedings and to thank all of you for attending and coming together to discuss your profession and to share your experiences. We're here in person at the Harold Williams Auditorium at the Getty Center, but we're also live streaming, as BJ mentioned. This conference is your first hybrid event. The presenters and attendees will be participating in person and online from multiple countries. So hello to all of you here in the room and out there in cyberspace. The first Mountmakers Forum conference was organized by Getty Museum Mountmakers and held at the Getty Villa in 2008, 14 years ago. The forum has evolved over the past 14 years into an internationally recognized group of professionals. Your biannual conferences, your website, your social media platforms have created a growing network dedicated to the sharing of crucial information related to the field. For this, I applaud you. Let me say how impressed and grateful we in the museum field are to see the professional development of mount making in the museum. The engineering skill, the artistry that you bring to the safe display of art is essential to our success as institutions. If you think about it, our mission at the Art Museum is primarily twofold: to care for the works of art we hold in public trust and ensure that our cultural heritage is preserved for future generations, and to display those same works in our galleries and special exhibitions in ways that engage a wide and diverse audience in compelling and memorable ways. In my position as Associate Director of Collections, I have the honor to work with lots of great colleagues here at the Getty dedicated to these tasks, from conservators, preparators, designers, curators, registrars, carpenters, and indeed mount makers. And I fully appreciate that in many museums, some of those roles are played by the same person: conservators, preparators, make mounts, etc. At the Getty, we're very lucky to have dedicated mount makers in several departments who work closely with their colleagues on these essential activities. And I've come to realize, this is my view, kind of that of all the jobs at the museum, in many ways, the most essential one, I'm coming to learn, is the mount maker. Thank you. I have this bad habit of sort of telling people what they want to hear, but let me explain. Because it's really the job of the mount maker that encapsulates those two roles that I just described. Of course, the primary responsibility is to ensure that the mount does the job, that it secures the precious object to the wall or to its pedestal, that minimizes the risk of damage, and keeps the art and the visitor safe. This responsibility is all the more acute in places like California, of course, where dramatic seismic activity makes the Mountmakers task all the more challenging and vital. I don't need to remind you of the pioneering work that Getty has done in the area of seismic mitigation, particularly with our development of base isolator systems that are world-renowned. Securing the work of art, its integrity, its stability, is first and foremost the job at hand. But I have to say, it is the other aspect of your role, displaying the work of art in a manner that maximizes the visitor's aesthetic, intellectual engagement, that has most impressed me over the years. I have to confess that one of my regular habits when visiting exhibitions of three-dimensional objects is to examine the mount, or try to find the mount, to marvel at the skill and creativity that you bring to this challenge. Sometimes I can't even see the mount or figure out how the exquisite work of art I'm admiring is floating in the vitrine I'm looking at. How'd they do that, I often ask myself. We're all in awe of your skill and ingenuity. Pause for clapping. Thank you. So I salute Mountmakers for the central role you play in keeping our precious works of art safe and for letting them sing in our galleries. I assure you that while many museum visitors might not understand what you do or even think about it, they feel it intuitively in the experience you provide. And for that, all of us who love art are in your debt. I wish you all a great conference over the next 2 days. I'm sorry about the weather, it's not very LA. Be mindful walking around the Getty, it's very slippery. We're not made for the rain, so I caution you as you walk around. But I'm very excited about this conference. I wish that I could spend more time listening to the papers, looking over the title of the presentations. I wish I could attend all of them myself. The titles are fabulous. I'm going to read a few, which struck me. Getting Bums on Seats. A K-pop pose for tiny clothes. Gritting Our Loins. I like this one. The Irresistible Attraction of the Magnets. And my favorite, Between Two Carts. I actually get that one. This is really the most intriguing list of conference papers I've ever encountered. I applaud your organization, and I encourage you to take this opportunity over the next several days to share ideas, exchange stories, and find new ways of taking your profession to an even higher level. And with that, I will turn the podium back over to BJ.
Thank you, Richard. Feel honored that you were able to open up our conference. Thank you again. As we start our conference, I'd like to take a few minutes to recognize Mark Maton, dear friend, beloved colleague, who passed away unexpectedly in August. Mark was a senior mount maker in the Decorative Arts and Sculpture Conservation Department here at the Getty Museum for 36 years before his retirement this past January. I was fortunate enough to have known him for 25 of those years and worked side by side with him for the last 7. I always like to think of Mark as one of the originals. He was on the ground floor, definitely laid a foundation for mount making here at the Getty and for our profession. He saw the Getty grow from a small museum to this current multi-site institution, and he had a hand in displaying virtually every three-dimensional object exhibited here at the Getty Center. These are just a few of the exhibits he worked on. Mark was also a big part of the International Mountmakers Forum from the very beginning. He actually presented at the first conference at the Getty Villa in 2008, which he presented memorably, in fact, by inserting this slide. It caught everyone off guard. It was right in the middle of his presentation. And it was classic Mark humor. It not only got everyone's attention from a very technical description of what he was talking about, but he got a nice little water break in between. Unfortunately, his water was misplaced during this presentation, and I started to drift a bit. But in all seriousness, Mark was a very active participant in the IMF. He was a member of our steering committee from the very beginning, and he helped the group grow and evolve. He never missed a conference. So, in his memory, we'd like to recognize his contribution to the field of mount making and to the International Mountmakers Forum. He will be missed. Thank you. Okay, so starting with our first presentation, this is a virtual presentation from the British Museum, Supporting the World of Stonehenge, by Sarah Choi, who's collection manager for the Loans and Display at the British Museum, Ben Fox, also of Loans and Display, and Phil Gell, also from the Loans and Display at the British Museum. So.
Hello, I'm Sarah Choi. I'm a collection manager at the British Museum, and I'm talking to you today with my colleagues Ben Fox and Phil Gell about the mount making that we undertook for our recent World of Stonehenge exhibition. So the World of Stonehenge was a major exhibition which was held at the British Museum earlier this year. It aimed to showcase the world of prehistoric Europe during the time that Stonehenge was constructed and in use. The video that you can see playing is a very short walkthrough of the exhibition, and it hopefully gives you a sense of its scale and final appearance. Over 700 objects were displayed, and this presented a considerable challenge in terms of planning, mount making, and installation. As well as a substantial number of objects from the British Museum's own collections, we borrowed from over 30 different lenders. Due to the scale of the exhibition, the mounts ended up being a combination of in-house and external fabrication. Over 250 mounts were produced, 150 of which were made in-house, and the remainder by external mount makers. In particular, we worked with Simon Micklejohn on the Sea Henge mount and with Plowden and Smith on the axe wall. This talk is going to focus on three particular areas of the mount making. So firstly, a display of weapons, which typifies the standard mount design that was developed for the entire exhibition. Secondly, how we worked with Plowden and Smith to create an X-case display of 90 hand axes and the mounting system that we created with them. And then finally, how we displayed the 6,000-year-old Sweet Track walkway, which had to be on open display. Many of the decisions that we took about the mount making was very much based on time limitations, on the number of objects, and on the complexities of installing during the COVID pandemic. So we hope this talk will explain some of our decisions in a little bit more detail, and that it will be an interesting case study of how we worked with external mount makers.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm an assistant collection manager at the British Museum. And along with Sarah and Phil, I was responsible for making many mounts for the Stonehenge exhibition. And I'm just going to give you a short talk about how we went about some of that. With such a large number of objects in the exhibition, there was a keen desire to bring display arrangements to life with a creative use of spaces, lighting, and object mounts. In design meetings, it became evident that particular case displays would benefit from mounting solutions which could elevate exhibits, producing a dynamic effect in conjunction with case inserts, lighting, and occasional audio-visual elements. After 2.5 years of outsourcing the majority of mount making for our exhibitions, we were back to producing in-house for a blockbuster exhibition requiring us to design and make around 150 mounts for a wide variety of objects, with only the Sea Henge and axe wall mounts going out to tender. Phil and I were their primary mount makers and formed a production line active over a number of months. With a hectic mount making and installation schedule lying in wait, the following points were key to mount design and production. Establishing a house style, providing continuity across displays, defining object support needs and mount complexity. Mounts needed to be fitted into cases quickly and effectively. Objects needed to be securely installed without difficulty. Compared to others in the exhibition, Case 49 has quite a simple display of objects, but it's a good example to break down our process of mount production and installation. Entitled Blood, Violence and Sacrifice, the case was to display an arrangement of weapons that had been deliberately damaged after use in battle, offerings compensating for spilt blood. Swords and spearheads were bent and broken and their edges cut. In the photo, you can see the majority of the objects laid out where we were determining how they would be positioned. From early on in the design of this display, the exhibition curators wanted to somehow convey this weapon-destroying ritual with a dark and sinister tone. The design went for a number of revisions, with the weapons originally sharing a case with human remains. Working with curators, we established object arrangements and positioning, which fed into the case layout design and guided the development of mounts. In the display design, all the weapons point upwards. We later changed this so the spearheads were pointing downwards, which helps bring more energy to the display. In the end, it was decided that all of the objects would be mounted, projecting relatively flat objects out from the backboard and accentuating the damage and distortion inflicted on the weapons. Cataloguing each object's support needs and the way it would be displayed allowed us to define a level of complexity, type of mount, and production time. This method had been developed a few years earlier for the El Bukhari Gallery project, the subject of a forum talk in 2018. For this case, the distorted swords required a higher level of mounting, whereas the spearhead mounts were more straightforward but still needed adequate support as they would be displayed in tilted positions. Here we have the mounts for the larger spearheads, along with a close-up shot shown in reverse of a mounted object, and here they are in front of me too. As part of the overall design scheme, all the brass mounts in the exhibition had to have a sandblasted finish, so clean and unfussy soldering and metalworking was essential. After a long period not making mounts, I felt the pressure to regain skills quickly. And here in this photo, we see the majority of the mounts created for this case. All the areas of a mount which came into contact with the object were softened and sueded polyethylene. The mounts were labeled up with descriptions, exhibition and registration numbers, along with the diameter of the mount stem. Photos of mounted objects were also taken for reference. So we come to installation. With a tight schedule, we needed to install the mounts and objects as efficiently as possible. To speed things up, paper templates of the objects were made, allowing us to define final positioning with curators without having to use the actual objects. The templates also marked the position of mount stems, allowing us to drill and fit the mounts quickly. Having made a lot of mounts, I wanted to install them as accurately as possible, and a drill guide, as we have here, was invaluable for keeping things straight. Once installed, we then defined how far objects needed to project out and fine-tune positioning. With everything installed, the details of the damaged weapons were picked out by case lights, with the gallery lights turned down as in many parts of the exhibition to bring a more dramatic edge to the display. And in this photo, we see the final display. Although individual cases had specific narratives and arrangements, it's important to mention the accumulated dynamic effect of using mounts through the exhibition to accentuate the physical, functional, and emotional qualities of the objects and their histories. Thank you.
So a major feature of the exhibition was the axe wall, and the aim was to show a large number of hand axes to represent the point at which prehistoric populations started manipulating the natural landscape by clearing areas of woodland. So it was initially intended to show over 300 axes, and this photo that you can see shows an early stage of the planning. Fortunately, they abandoned the idea of 300 axes and it was reduced to 90, and this is to represent the number of generations who cleared the woodland. So the challenge was to turn the collection of objects from this image into this, which is how the designers envisaged they'd be displayed. And this is X-case on large Perspex panels. I'm sure many of you who have worked X-case with portable objects and in Perspex understand the challenges that that posed. So obviously, the first is object safety. These are hand axes, they're portable, and they're on open display. So our mounting system firstly had to be secure as well as discreet. Also, we had to consider the time to make the mounts. So this is 90 mounts. And when we consider the volume of the mount making across the entire exhibition, we decided to treat this as a discrete package and work with an external mount maker. And we chose to work with Plowden and Smith on this particular aspect of the mount making. And we also had considerations around the installation. So we had to find a system that would minimise the amount of work we had to do during installation, where we had over 700 objects to install, and also allow for there still to be some tweaking to the design. To help with this, we made a prototype mount and a prototype object. So this is not a real hand axe. It's a beautifully rendered version in leftover wood. And so we had several considerations when we were working with Plowden and Smith. Firstly, the axes couldn't leave the museum, so they had to come to us every time for measuring up and fitting. For safety, the axes had to have this top set of returns, so they couldn't be removed from the wall. And so it became very clear that a modular system would be needed. We also had to consider how the mounts were going to be attached into the Perspex wall, and that the designers would want some flexibility in the distance of the object from the backboard. And we also had to consider how to make the installation of them as straightforward as possible, given the wider context of a very, very complex installation. So Plowden and Smith came up with a three-part mount. So this was a central square section with either one or two stems, which depended on the weight of the object, and then an upper and lower set of returns, both held in place with a grub screw. So this allowed Plowden and Smith to fabricate the mount in their own workshop and then bring them to the museum for final fitting of the top and bottom set of returns. And the removable upper and lower returns gave a good degree of flexibility when actually fitting the mounts. The British Museum then fabricated the receivers, which there were 140 of these made in total, and this would then allow for the depth of the object from the backboard to be altered at installation. We knew that we wouldn't have time during the installation to lay out the objects, and for the curators and designers at that point to decide where they wanted everything to be positioned. And we also really wanted to minimise the need for drilling into the Perspex during the installation time. As you know, the dangers of working with Perspex are one wrong move and the panel can crack very easily. And these were panels that we knew couldn't be replaced due to their size. So we decided what we would do is ask the build contractors to pre-drill the holes for all of the mount stems in advance. So this meant that we had to do an extensive templating process. So we replicated the size of each panel in paper, and then this allowed the curatorial and design teams to lay the axes out, which is what you can see being done in one of the images. We then drew around each axe, and this then gave us a total of 5 different templates that we could use, so we knew exactly where each axe was going. Then when Plowden and Smith came to measure everything up, they were able to mark the stem positions on our templates. We then did a double check when the final mounts came to us, and so we were able to make a template to pass to the contractor, and they could then drill the holes for us. So when we came to install, everything was ready to go. So the installation itself turned out to be one of the most straightforward parts of the process. It only really took a day and a half to install the receivers, the mounts, and the objects. And this was because of the extensive templating process. So the receivers were fitted into place, and then the mounts put into position, and then the objects finally installed on the mount. So although a lot of planning, preparation time, the payoff was a very quick installation, which we needed given the complexity. And so this is the finished axe wall. It was a very popular part of the exhibition. Visitors really enjoyed it. They enjoyed being able to see the objects without glass in front of them. There are probably a few things I'd like to change. Some of the angles aren't quite right, but I think given how complex this was, how little time we had, that it was a successful display.
Following on from what Ben and Sarah have said about the development of the mount style for Stonehenge and the aesthetic choices informing our mount designs, I want to talk about a real showstopper object, so a standout part of the display that really punctuates the viewer's journey around our exhibition. There were several of these in Stonehenge. We had the extraordinary Seahenge monument, the extremely sort of ambitious and kind of great scale of the axe wall, and between the two, a section of a Neolithic trackway called the Sweet Track. So what's the importance of these bits of ancient bogwood? They were discovered in the 1970s by Ray Sweet during peat excavations, and what were uncovered were the remains of a 1.2 mile long trackway that was built in 3807 BC to cross the marshes of the Somerset Levels. So this is a pretty remarkable piece of Stone Age engineering, not for something monumental like Stonehenge itself, but for something a bit more prosaically utilitarian. Although we do know that the trackway had cultural and symbolic significance, a large number of objects were found alongside the track, and there's too many of them and they're too precious to have simply been sort of people dropping things or objects falling through holes in pockets. The relatively small sample section, really, of the track that the British Museum looks after amounts to a little over 3 metres, which in terms of the trackway is obviously a small section, but as an object, that's still quite sizable. Many years ago, it was erected in the permanent galleries in a rather dated diorama surrounded by reeds, which hid the metal poles and the fishing wire that were holding it in place. But for a long time, it's been in storage in a very large number of carefully labelled boxes. I had the old drawings from this display, which are almost as old as the track itself, and they indicated where the individual pieces went. But apart from that, it was really a question of starting from scratch. So this mount was always going to be several things coming together, a challenge to make this an aesthetically viable display, and also a way to discreetly recreate the object. And it was also decided that this was going to be on open display, so what I had to produce needed to also be a security mount. So in other words, the multiple pieces had to be suspended as if touching, but not touching, look as close as possible to how we think the track originally looked, and also needed to prevent overeager visitors from walking off with a piece. So at the beginning, I knew from the start that the mount was going to need to be very sturdy. The planks are oak, and the cross pieces needed to be supported at quite a high angle from the floor. As well as being heavy, these pieces are extremely fragile and friable. They fall apart as soon as you look at them, and the surface is very soft, so it was really important to have a method for fabricating a structure that minimalised handling as much as possible. Holding the pieces securely and eliminating bowing in the mount to avoid sections of the object coming into contact meant that the structure itself would have to be very rigid. So there was no real question that it was going to be a welded steel mount. Another advantage of welding the mount was that, in a sense, I could pick a starting point of the object, and then using spot welds, I could tack together a structure piece by piece that allowed for a lot of adjustment. So we have this very useful, idealized archaeological diagram of the trackway in section, which gave me the basic methodology. But obviously it wouldn't be possible to just measure each piece, draw up a simple plan and go away and make something. I had to constantly check each component of the mount against the object and its surrounding parts. And I also didn't have a secure prep space big enough to have the track assembled in anything other than small sections at a time. So there was a lot of going back and forth, making comparisons between pieces of the object, pieces of the mount, and other pieces of the mount. I began with the uprights. I started with a pair of cross stakes, one laid diagonally on a piece of paper and the other suspended above it, resting on dense foam. And then I played around with the angle between the two to find a minimum and maximum range that would allow me to fit the base rail snugly underneath the crossing point and the plank to fit similarly above it. I then checked that each of the other pairs of stakes could meet at a similar angle, whilst allowing for that clearance above and below for the other corresponding planks and base rails. And that gave me a rough data set from which I was able to work out a kind of modal average. From this, I was able to gauge an appropriate consistent height for the planks of the walkway to sit at and an ideal angle for all of the stakes. This was obviously just a starting point and a readily alterable one. The Neolithic builders would not have been out there with protractors and tape measures. But I thought that a certain uniformity would help highlight the consistency of purpose, really, that had allowed Neolithic craftspeople to extend this construction over almost 6,000 feet. So I made a support for each individual stake, a strut that fitted to its unique shape and would fix to the baseboard with arms to cradle the stake in place. Then 2 completed stakes were placed back to back, crossing over with the right amount of space below and above. And at this point, I used wooden boxes to hold the planks in place above the stakes at the predetermined height. I could therefore make easy adjustments to check that everything fitted and was brought into near contact. Once I was happy with where the struts needed to meet, I marked the point, welded them together back to back into an X-brace, and then fixed them to a baseboard. With the planks suspended on the boxes, I was then able to measure for and fabricate a section that would fit to the top of the X-brace and support the underside of the plank. There was need for a lot of adjustment and flexibility in these because the stakes are all different widths and shapes, as are the planks. So now each finished X-brace was able to support a pair of stakes and one end of the plank. I then attached a joining strip between the braces under where 2 of the planks were going to sit to give the span proper support. The plan originally was to attach small arms underneath the crossing point of the X-brace, which would hold the base rails in place. Unfortunately, for 3 of the 4 weeks that I'd set aside to construct this mount, the welding shop at the museum was unexpectedly, and for me, disastrously off limits to staff, and so I had to adjust my plans. The schedule was just too tight, and there were still many other mounts that Ben and I had to work on, including a large number of mounts for loan objects which were arriving during the install period. So I ended up with a bit of a compromise. The under rails had to be sat on basic vertical supports coming up from the deck, which meant that they were more visible. But the advantage of this was that the already constructed parts of the mount could be cleaned up and spray painted whilst I worked on those last sections. Similarly, I didn't have time to make the security fittings as I had planned, and what I ended up with were a series of brazed brass brackets which attached to the welded frame with security screws once the object parts were in place. This was fine and relatively discreet, but not the kind of hand-in-glove system I'd envisaged with machined slots for sliding parts that would give a really nice snug fit. Sarah, Ben, and our excellent colleague Rachel Mortlock gave me a lot of their time at this very last rushed stage, grinding, brazing, and painting, for which I'm immensely grateful, especially as we started to get into the last few hours before install. As we were so close to the wire at this stage, install was the first time that I was able to properly see the mount all laid out and try the whole object on it. We set up tables next to the install space for a final fit and check, and to allow me to make a template, a very simple one that just mapped out the object, so we could center it on the display pedestal and to show where the holes needed to be drilled to fix the braces down. At this stage, I could also work out how close the various sections of the walkway needed to be to each other. Then it was a relatively simple matter of removing the object, taking the mount apart, and reassembling the entire structure on the exhibition pedestal and placing the object pieces back on it. There are times in our profession when we get to work on really special objects and challenges, and the prospect of reassembling a 6,000-year-old boardwalk was extremely exciting. And it's those moments of excitement, I think, where we want to produce our best work, work we can be really proud of. Unfortunately, this ended up being an occasion where time and circumstances beyond my control, chiefly losing the welding room for 3 weeks, and the unavoidable slowdown of COVID safe working restrictions, just meant lowering my sights a bit and focusing on just getting the object in. I think it probably looked fine for the average viewer, but it didn't quite match up to my initial vision of it. Nevertheless, this was a fascinating problem to work on and a really ambitious design decision to make the Sweet Track, this amazing artifact, so accessible. And hopefully the museum will display it again one day so I can have another crack at it. Thank you for the opportunity to present at the 2022 Forum. This was a very special exhibition, one we were all very proud to have worked on, and it's great to be able to share it with you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Ben. Sarah. Thank you, Phil. Do we have any questions?
We do have a virtual question. Someone wanted to know, how were the receivers inserted into the plexi?
Are you going to answer that, Sarah, or they were screwed in, weren't they, Phil?
Yeah, they're basically the sort of fairly standard receivers that I think you're all familiar with. Yeah.
Were they threaded in, or did they have? Were they netted up from the back?
Yeah, I think they're pretty. Yeah, just who's doing about. Also, I can't remember. Were they kind of like, and also had nuts at the back as well? Phil, yeah.
Thank you. To Phil, I think, what would you do differently on the Sweet Track mount in the future? It looked pretty darn good as it is.
Sorry, I couldn't hear the question.
What would you do differently for the Sweet Track mount in the future?
So I think the fact that it was on open display meant that the mount had to be kind of chunkier than I was expecting. I also would have liked to have had to make it more subtle. But as I say, the problems with having access to the welding room just meant that it was very rushed. But yeah, I mean, it's an incredible, it's a great challenge. Just, you know, like sometimes you have a sort of vision of how something's going to look, and it just didn't quite make it.
It might be helpful if you could mute your speakers unless you're talking. We're getting some feedback.
We have another virtual question. How long was this exhibition installed? It looks like a longer-term installation with all that casework. And who was the case maker again?
So we, our case maker, we have a reusable system of cases in the British Museum. It's a Hahn Lauder system, so it's almost a flat pack system. So for every exhibition, we're able to reconfigure the showcases into what's required. and we then occasionally have bespoke cases made, and they're generally in perspex. The show lasted from February to July, which was really short for the amount of work that we had to do. It felt like we were installing a permanent gallery, to be honest. But I think how we installed it is going to influence some of the new permanent galleries that will happen in the museum in the future. And hopefully a lot of those mounts can be reused. And the installation itself took 4.5 weeks in total.
Any more questions? Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Ben. Great presentation. Beautiful, beautiful exhibit. Congratulations. So moving on to our next presentation, it's also virtual. Simon Barron is going to present How Do You Store a 450-pound tapestry covered in pins?
Hello, Mountmakers Forum. My name is Simon Barron, and I am currently a senior project manager at Holman Exhibits, an exhibition fabrication company in Toronto, Canada. I was formerly the installation project manager at the Aga Khan Museum, which is where the following project occurred. In 2015, the Aga Khan Museum acquired a 450-pound or 200-kilogram tapestry by artist Aisha Khalid. The large-scale work, titled Your Way Begins on the Other Side, is 18 feet long, or almost 5.5 meters long, by 5'10" or 175 centimeters wide. It is composed of layers of silk and velvet and is studded with 1.2 million unsecured gold-plated pins, forming an intricate pattern. Though the piece was shipped from Pakistan in a crate to Canada, the shipping crate was unsuitable for long-term storage, and a new mount had to be created to store it long-term. You can see the crate in these photos. The tapestry was attached at various points to the corners of the crate with fabric strips to keep it taut, with foam and newspaper in between the folded section. The foam was in very rough shape and was falling apart. We were picking off tiny pieces of foam for months after the installation. The artist also had to be on site to put back all the pins that had fallen out during shipping and the uncrating. If the pin heads contacted each other when the piece was folded, they would interlock and pull each other out. It cost a lot of literal sweat and blood to install the work for the first time. The work was on display for 3 years in our atrium. Like many non-gallery spaces, our atrium is a less than ideal place to leave artworks for any length of time. It has huge windows, and anything that gets displayed there is subjected to full daylight, and it was time to give it a break. Here is the mount. The frame is built out of plywood, 2x4, dowels, and sonotube. The whole thing is coated in Marvel Seal to prevent any possible contact of the tapestry with the unfinished wood. We initially thought about folding it, similarly to how it was shipped. However, having to keep the fabric taut and under tension while it was being stored was going to degrade the fabric over time. The idea of draping it over multiple tubes came about when thinking about the smallest size we could make it without having it touch itself. It cuts down on the load on any point, so there is less strain on the fabric. Also, the draping method allows for the tapestry to take advantage of gravity when dismantling. You don't need to lift the tapestry at all to pack it, just gently guide it into position and it naturally falls into the mount. We weren't sure exactly how it was going to sit on the mount, so we added a few notches to it so we can adjust the height of the Tyvek hammock by moving dowels up and down. The Tyvek hammock then sits over the top of the frame to cradle the tapestry and help remove the strain that it is under when it is stored. The dismantle took place in July 2017 and was a very stressful day. We didn't know how the tapestry would behave once it hit the mount. We were worried that it would slip off as the bulk of the tapestry came down, or that our math for how big to make it was wrong. We used chain funnels attached to the ceiling to gently lower the tapestry into the mount below. 4 preparators wearing puncture-resistant gloves guided the tapestry into position as we lowered it. It took a fair amount of effort and back and forth to get it to sit properly, but nobody's got so much as a pinprick, which is a small miracle. Here are just a few photos of the actual dismantle. So that was after we got it over the first hurdle, and it laid perfectly within the hammock, and our math was actually quite good, and it sat exactly how we wanted it to, which was a huge relief on that day. Here is moving it away. Here's some sort of close-up glamour shots of the back side of it, showing the pin prick side. Another shot. Surveying the fruits of our effort after a long day, and the awesome team that made it all happen. The tapestry now fits in our collection storage area in an area that's approximately 6 feet by 4 feet and can be moved by one person with a pallet jack. The tapestry has been displayed 3 times at the Aga Khan Museum, and every time I appreciate how much thought and time we were able to put into this mount. It takes the stress out of an installation that has many potential safety issues for the piece and the public. Thanks so much for coming to my talk. Bye.
Thank you, Simon. That great presentation. Incredible challenges you overcame.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to share that experience with everyone here.
Do we have any questions for Simon?
Hey Simon, my name's Ruben. That's really wild. What was the tapestry like based the backer made of? Was it wool? And if so, was the museum conscious of pests or any kind of pest control?
The tapestry was built out of many layers of silk and velvet that were just kind of put on top of each other and sewn together. So I think there was about 5 or 6 layers of fabric that kept the whole thing together. There was some concern about pests, especially coming from Pakistan and on such a long journey to get there. But we've never had an issue with them so far. So yeah, cross our fingers.
Hello, my name is Sakina. The hammock idea was mind-blowing. What were some of the pre-ideas before you got to the hammock idea and stuck with that? What were some of the failed ones in throwing paint at the wall and doing this job?
Well, we really wanted to, we really needed to fit it in a small space just because our storage is not large at the Aga Khan Museum. So we were really thinking about folding it, but anytime we kind of tried to sort of visualize it, there was always some sort of challenge in that, especially because, like I said in the presentation, when those pin heads come together, they just lock in really tight and they just pull each other out right away. And it was just, it wouldn't work. And then we also thought about just kind of draping it in half, but then we didn't have the ceiling height for that, and trying to move it around would have been a nightmare. There was also thought about kind of folding it, but on its side, but then there was no way to sort of secure it. We thought about clips, but nothing kind of made any sense until we kind of had this aha moment and just of course, we'll just drape it. So yeah, that was our sort of thought process. But yeah, we had a lot of ideas that were just bad.
Hi, can you hear me? I had a question about how did you determine the angle of the drape of the Tyvek, and then how is the Tyvek held in place once you determine that?
So the actual angle of the Tyvek, we calculated the length of, we took the length of the tapestry, then we actually cut a piece of rope and figured out, and then draped it on the mount, and then cut the piece of Tyvek to be the same size, slightly longer, and then we wrapped it around the dowels that are at the bottom, and then those can be sort of moved up and down off of different notches, so that we could kind of adjust the height of the hammock so that it would take the weight in the middle of the actual tapestry, and so it's not just sort of hanging under its own power. And yeah, so we kind of, we did as much testing as we could, and then we came up with a sort of adjustable solution, and it actually worked out perfectly the first time we set it in, and we didn't have to do any adjusting.
We have a couple of virtual questions. Did it truly weigh 450 pounds?
It did. Actually, it's funny because a lot of the weight comes from the top and bottom bars. So there's a top steel bar that's, I think it's 1/2 inch thick by about sort of like 5 inches tall by the full width of the carpet. And that alone weighs about, I think it was 80 pounds. And then the bottom bar is kind of like a smaller version of that. So that weighed another like 40. So the tapestry itself only weighed about, 320 to 50 pounds. And then the actual mounting hardware added quite a bit to that amount.
The other question is, what is the stuff you sealed the cart with?
That's Marvel Seal, which is a kind of like the interior of a chip bag or a crisp bag if you're in London. So it's got a sort of some sort of plastic on the inside of it that you can use an iron, and it melts onto things to put a sort of physical barrier in between two different objects. So we just used an iron, and you iron it on over the wood to stop any kind of contact between the two materials.
Thank you, Simon.
Hello. Have you thought about if it has to travel, like what would you do better than that crate that you received it in? And does it keep you up?
I think we would build a crate to just probably roll the current mount in. I think also we would try and add something to stabilize it a bit. So tie downs to wrap around maybe the center of the sort of middle of the hammock to keep it down and have it not sort of shift from side to side as it's traveling. Yeah, that's a really good question and a really big challenge. I don't know if it's ever going to travel, but it is possible. So that's something that someone else is just going to have to figure out. We didn't quite get that far. We were just happy to get it off the ground, out of the air and onto the ground.
We have another virtual question. How did you decide the diameters of the tubes? And for storage, was it covered by some conservation material?
So the diameter of the tubes were sort of the easiest to access and widest sonotubes we could buy at the time. That was kind of it. We wanted to make them as big as possible without being absurdly big, so that to sort of take as much strain off the sort of top point as possible. And then when it does get put into conservation, the whole thing gets draped in Tyvek to sort of keep anything out, and it gets regularly monitored for pests. And we kind of pull it out, every 3 to 4 months just to take a look at it and make sure that it's still stable.
Any more questions for Simon? Thank you, Simon. Great presentation.
Thanks so much, everybody. It was great to be here.
We have one more virtual presentation this morning. This is from Jill Comer, who is a senior exhibition specialist at the Harvard Art Museums. She will be presenting Disrupting the View, Floating Plates, Uncovered Porcelains at the Harvard Art Museums.
Hello, I'm Jill Comer, Senior Exhibition Specialist and Mountmaker at the Harvard Art Museums. Thanks so much to the IMF for having me. In July of 2022, the Harvard Art Museums opened an installation of Arlene Sheckett's recent work, displayed alongside works from our own collection of porcelain and decorative arts. In this photo, our designer, Ellie Glenn, is on the left, the artist Arlene Sheckett is at right, and Steve Dean, my fellow Mountmaker, is at center. Much of the artwork in this exhibition would be vulnerably accessible, and the display ideas would demand new approaches to conservation and mount making. Many of the objects were uncovered, including in embedded wall niches and in floating grids of plates on cast concrete pedestals and as freestanding sculptures in multiple parts. Here is a shot of the gallery at night from outside, which I think really conveys how densely packed and exposed an installation we were tasked with securing. We call this gallery the Winter Garden, and while it has glass on 3 sides, it is a very small space, heightening our safety concerns. When we first started to work on the Arlene Sheckett exhibition, we were all at home because of COVID-19, and my role was remote mount design and mechanical problem solving from afar. After an early iteration of mounted plates on a vertical sheet of glass, the design quickly evolved into a metal framework from which plates would branch out. We had several Zoom meetings with Arlene and her team, and Ellie continually updated his design drawings as we began to hone our ideas for how the mounts could be attached and articulated. The main challenge for mounting the plates was to figure out how to safely secure them onto the display armature, and there was also a desire to tip the plates in different directions. This is the prototype that I fabricated out of brass at right, and you can see at center left an example of a plate mount stem. The end that attaches to the grid has a U-channel that fits onto the square stock and is secured with 2 set screws. We designed an articulated elbow joint which allowed us to tilt the plates once they were secured to the grid. Where the stem attaches to the plate, we added a rubber washer, which allowed the plates to have some flexibility if interfered with once on view. We experimented with many rubber washers of different diameters to get just the right resistance to pressure. In the end, we had the parts for the grids and for these mount stems fabricated for us out of steel, both for the increased strength it would provide and for the ease of milling the intricate and precise mechanisms. I'll return to this mounting system later, but first I want to touch on Arlene's planning visit to the museum a year ago in September 2021. In preparation for Arlene's visit, everyone on our exhibitions crew had a hand in making mock-ups and temporarily deinstalling the Winter Garden Gallery. Steve made cardboard versions of the pedestals and wall niches, and I mocked up Ellie's printouts of the plates and cardboard and devised a system for clamping them onto the model of the grid armature fabricated in wood so that we would be prepared to make the most out of the one-day visit. During the visit, we went through the gallery, fine-tuning the layout of the exhibition, and slowly began placing the cardboard plates on the 2 grids. In the afternoon, we worked in the museum's Art Study Center, laying out the artwork that would go in the niches and atop the pedestals, and I took as many notes and pictures as I could to prepare for the mount making to come. The 2 mock-up hanging grids were moved to the mount shop, still intact for further measurements. Steve and I met with Angela Chang and Tony Siegel from the Objects Lab, and we made lists of what plates would need traditional mounts and which plates were good candidates for a new mounting system of adhering an aluminum disc to the foot of a plate, a more experimental and direct approach. In this slide, you can see examples of the more traditional brass plate mounts that we made, which secure the plates at 3 points along the rim, with the top clip providing mechanical attachment. In total, Steve and I made 45 plate mounts, including the discs, not to mention the many other mounts fabricated for decks, wall niches, and freestanding sculpture. I'm going to pivot to Tony and Angela's piece of this project, namely researching adhesives for mounting. For the objects on concrete decks, Tony experimented with flexible mounting using silicone. In Angela's words, since porcelain is an incredibly strong yet brittle material, we were most concerned with physical damage. We worried that mechanical brass mounts that fix objects to a deck could cause damage if someone tried to pull in an object. So going against the usual approach of immobilizing an object, Tony experimented with building in flexibility with adhesive mounts. Here are some of his tests using silicone caulk. When silicone sets, it remains flexible and rubbery, and if it is applied thickly, this effect increases. I'd like to make clear that silicone is not a material we normally apply to art objects, so we tested ways to remove it safely, such as applying an intermediate reversible layer between the object and silicone. In this case, it was clear tape. Here are a couple of examples of objects that were secured with silicone caulking during installation. We assisted Sue Costello from Conservation during install, and plenty of time was allowed for the silicone to cure. While we were experimenting with aluminum discs for the plates in the mount shop, Tony in Conservation was doing his own experimenting with flexibility and trying different adhesives. He was also using a rubber stopper as a washer. Here, Tony demonstrates the strength and flexibility of this design. Also, the plates can turn without loosening. I'm not going to play this whole video as it upsets my stomach a little bit. For the final plate mounts, we ended up using adhesive mounts to attach aluminum discs to smaller and lighter plates with B72, and traditional brass mounts for larger, heavier plates. Also, if a plate had previous breakage and repair, or any additional surface paint or historic markings, we went with a traditional mount, as the acetone used for removing an adhered mount could affect the plate's surface and repair. Steve fabricated the aluminum discs and painted them to match the plates, and then I assembled the parts it left to make half of the mount stem. They were then handed off to Angela to be adhered to the plates with enough time for the B72 to fully set. The picture it left shows the two different types of mounts in action, the top being an adhered disc and the bottom a more traditional style mount. The picture at right is an example of reversing the design of a traditional mount in order to show the back of a plate. In this image, you can see mounts made for nearly identical plates in order to see both sides, something that was important to the artist. On the first day of installation, we began by assembling and hanging the two prefabricated steel grids from the ceiling. Ellie supplied us with extensive drawings of the plate layout, and from there we were able to pre-install the plates on the grid so that when Arlene arrived, we could adjust the angles of display, some up and down, some right and left. The pre-install also allowed us to drill divots into the grid so that the set screws would not fail, which helped me to sleep easier. Moving away from the plates now, I'm going to show you mounts for one of the wall niches that was uncovered to present two different examples of objects with invisible or nearly invisible mounts. Here is a finished installation shot of a niche at right, and at left you can see some pictures from Arlene's visit during which the objects were arranged in tandem with the objects displayed in front of the niches on the three concrete pedestals. The niche had a removable deck plate, in this case a mirrored acrylic sheet. So for the teacup at the top left, I made a brass mount that could be bolted through the deck. Angela glued the mount to the foot of the cup with B72 in advance, and then I attached the object to the mirrored panel right before installation. In a similar way, the cylindrical sculpture below had a hollow opening at back, so I made a mount that would lock into place inside the object's inner form, which also was then mechanically attached to the panel. Once both objects were attached and in place, the deck was then carefully placed and secured within the niche. My last example of using adhesives involves us physically altering one of Arlene's sculptures, hopefully for the better. At left is the exhibition curator, Lynette Roth, standing next to a sculpture called Grammar. Grammar came to us in two parts, the bottom of which is a welded steel base with a painted wood cylinder attached to it. Resting on top is a large ceramic piece, but it had no means of securing to the base, and with felt pads stuck on the bottom, it could easily be pushed off despite its weight. All we had to work with was an existing hole, as you can see at right. Our solution, in collaboration with Arlene's team, was to fabricate a 1/16 inch stainless steel plate that would be B72 to the bottom of the ceramic, with an undersized drilled hole located precisely at the point where the hole in the ceramic was located. That way, we were able to drill into the steel base and attach a brass rod or pin that could be received by that stainless steel hole without ever engaging the cracked and fragile hole in the ceramic. Hopefully, this slide can give you a better idea of the interplay between the two pieces. Angela adhered the steel disc to the sculpture, and at install, we simply set the ceramic piece atop the base, engaging the pin in the hole, and further secured it with museum wax as the hole was not centered. This process resulted in stabilizing the two facets invisibly, which was important to the artist. Lastly, two cylindrical mounts were screwed to the floor, engaging the feet of the base to prevent tipping. Thanks so much for listening to my talk. I don't often work with living artists and with so many moving parts, so this project was especially challenging. I couldn't have done it without Steve Dean and all the fruitful collaborations with so many of our museum colleagues, especially Tony, Angela, and Sue from the Objects Lab. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jill. Great presentation.
Thanks. Hi, everybody.
Thank you, Jill, for being able to change gears so quickly as well.
Yeah, we appreciate that.
I know, I wish I was there. I got COVID last minute, so.
We hope you're feeling okay.
Sorry, BJ. Was this exhibition a temporary or permanent installation?
It's temporary, but it's up for 3 years, which is pretty long for us.
Is the collection the artist's collection, or is it the museum's collection?
It's both.
Thank you.
Is that too short an answer? Should I embellish?
Hello, I have a question. Can you speak a little bit about removing the B72, the process involved?
See, this is where I wish Angela was here to answer these questions. I think generally what they do, but if there's a conservator in the audience, they could probably say better. I think generally what they do, like they would take a plate and actually put it in a bag and have some sort of source of acetone, and that would soften it up. And they would be able to remove that mount. One of the things we did was we drilled extra holes in the aluminum discs so they could also get solvent in that way. But again, when they applied the B72, they also had glass micro balloons. So somehow the B72 was thicker, and so I think that would involve a little bit of extra work removing it.
Are there concerns about adhesive failure over 3 years?
I mean, we were concerned, but we did tests, and so far so good. It's worked really, really well.
Since the installation, has there been any damage to the plates?
No.
And then looking back, would you change any mounting techniques?
No, I don't think we would. Probably just for the sheer fact that we haven't had any problems. I think I did express in the slideshow that we were pretty nervous, and especially throughout the process when we were trying to make up our minds what we were going to use. Like, it was a little bit stressful because it goes counter to how we usually display things. But like I said, the gallery is small. People are instructed to, the security attendants try to only keep it to 8 viewers at a time. And like I said, so far so good.
What durometer did you ultimately settle on for the rubber washers, and have you noticed any degradation to them over the period of the display?
I mean, I think we're hoping that they'll be fine just for 3 years. It's 70A, which is considered hard. I wrote that down because I'm not that familiar, but I figured someone would ask. We're expecting them to be, we tighten them. So there's a machine screw that goes in and tightens the disc to the mount stem, and they're fairly tight. So like in the video, like if you spin a plate, it's not going to loosen the screw, but there is still some flexibility. So I would imagine that that shouldn't be too affected in 3 years.
Could you elaborate on the application of the silicone where you said that there was a tape layer that was the barrier layer between the actual object and the silicone? Was how I interpreted it, and how the tape would possibly affect the object.
Well, again, this is a question for a conservator, but the tape was only applied to glazed ceramics, and I'm sure they wouldn't have applied it to something that was at all fragile or had any issues. So I'd imagine it should pull off very easily once the show is over.
On the articulated elbows, did you do any kind of tooth or gearing inside that to make sure that it wouldn't slide or droop over time?
No, the thing we did is, it's just a simple machine screw, but I don't know if you can see this. This is so dweeby. Can you see this? The joint is made so that it can only go so far in either direction. And we did tighten them up as tight as we could. So it seemed pretty solid. And if for some reason something were to happen, at least it wouldn't go all the way down or all the way to one side. It has a stop to it. Again, this is like my first time making a mount that is movable, which is, I guess, pretty terrifying.
Any more questions? I think we have one more question.
Hi, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about working with Arlene Scheckett and having a ceramicist decide how you're going to display ceramics from your collection?
I mean, it was overall pretty positive. I mean, I think the things that were, anxiety producing for me weren't necessarily directly from Arlene. It was more just sort of the overall concepts. Like, I mean, kind of the idea to float a lot of plates, and especially some from our collection, was sort of decided, I mean, without necessarily my consultation, curatorially. So it was just going to happen. And I'm trying to think. I mean, like I said, I am not used to working with living artists so much, but it seemed to go as smoothly as it could, if that answers your question.
Hi, one more question. You said you started the design of these mounts during COVID. What software were you using to design the mounts?
Well, I was just kind of drawing by hand and emailing pictures back and forth, but Ellie then kind of took that over, and I'm pretty sure he used SketchUp to make his drawings, because he was sending drawings to Arlene back and forth and then checking in with us. So I was more like, I mean, once I was able to get in, because at a certain point I was able to go into work every so often, and then I would work on the prototypes then. So SketchUp, I'd say.
Hi, really nice display there. I like that. I was curious, exactly what kind of clear tape did you use?
Again, I'm not 100%, but I think it's probably just that crystal clear tape, just regular tape.
Like Scotch tape?
Like a packing tape, kind of.
Packing tape, that's what I thought. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Jill, thank you so much. We're really glad you were able to present.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun.
So I'm happy to introduce our first in-person presenter for today, Joe Dickinson, who's here from London. Please come on up.
Hello. Do shout if you can't hear me. I'm getting a lot of feedback. So I'm Joe. Today I will be speaking about the thought process of planning and executing a mount using a costume in the Victoria and Albert Museum's theatre collection as a case study. I'm focusing a lot more on a single mount, unlike the previous presenters. So first I'm just going to talk a bit about the things we consider when we're planning a mount, which tend to focus, as we've already seen, on the important aspects for a visitor to see, and then contrasting that with the conservation concerns that might limit our mounting options. The object I'm discussing in this talk is a costume worn by Sir Henry Iving as the demon Mephistopheles in Faust. Henry Iving was a very famous British Victorian-era actor, manager. He was the first actor, actually, to be awarded a knighthood, which shows his importance. And this is a costume from a performance in 1885, which actually traveled to America. This performance also utilized a really early instance of special effects in theatre, where Irving, as the manager, sort of designed special effects with the lighting that would be very dim in a gaslit theatre at that time, having glasses that would make the demon's eyes gleam, and special connections in a glove and shoe, which allowed sparks to fly between swords during a sword fight scene between the demon and the protagonist. And this performance was so well known that it was replicated in a advertisement for crackers. So evidently the sparks were considered important. So the parts that are included in this costume are, as you can see, the whole get-up of Sir Henry with the cloak, jerkin, breeches, and a lot of these, what I'll say, phrase as the costume elements, were already planned to be displayed on a mannequin, which was mounted by Geisa Werner, requiring some minimal support from me. You can see that the tail there is just being held up by a bit of string, and I made a simple swing mount, essentially, to support that, and a little bit of support to get the hood in place. But primarily, I'll be talking about the glove and the shoe, and these invisible glasses, which look like they're from the 90s, but are actually from the 1880s. So I spoke to the curators about which are the important aspects of this costume to be seen, or the accessories. So like I said, for the glasses, the really important thing is seeing how minimal they are, because it's very strange for this period. But generally, when theatrical or costume elements are displayed, part of what we try and do is convey some of the animation of that performance, because it's such an important part of the item. And we want to see what the audience would see as a visitor. So we want to see this plain side of the glove and shoe, but we also want to see the inside, how the tricks work, those metal elements of the glove and shoe, which are connected by a very old and frayed electrical cable, which would have run up through the trousers and down the sleeve. So, having chatted about what was important, I proposed a couple of different potential display methods. Either in order to utilize this animation that Geisa had got from in the mannequin from the costume, displaying them off the mannequin. So the glasses on the face and the shoes and gloves they wouldn't have fitted on this mannequin because his hands and feet are a lot larger than a Victorian gentleman's, but aligned with them so that you'd got an impression of what it would have looked like on stage. The limitations of that would be that obviously it's a lot more difficult to see both sides of the elements if they're displayed alongside the costume, but also the glasses were so small, as much as that is the intent, it'd make it hard to see them. And they might look a little bit odd on this featureless face, which was the mannequins used in this display. So the other option I proposed was to have them separate from the mannequin. Obviously, that does slightly disassociate the different elements of the costume, but it allows those special effects to be highlighted. And using a simple mirror, we could show both sides of the glove and shoes that we could see how the special effects work, but also how invisible that would have been to the viewer. We also discussed, which I think is an important thing to talk about, even at a mount making conference, is how important not making a mount sometimes is. The glasses are such fine wire that any mount I made, in order for it to be structurally stable enough to support it, would have been overpowering and would have hidden those wire elements. So we decided just to place those on a plinth and have the glove and the shoe separate to that on a floating mount over an angled mirror so that we could, like I said, see all of those sides. In order to try and retain some of that animation of the costume, the curators requested that we try and bend the fingers on the glove to give us an impression of a sword grip. And then there's always the conservation concerns, which tend to limit what we want to do. There were some fragile elements of the shoe, which just required a bit of additional mount making support. I did acrylic inside to make sure it wasn't collapsing in on itself, and just some elements to avoid where the upper and the sole were separating. But the particular concern was the glove, which was very fragile, and that fragility limited the ability to bend the fingers. The other thing that conservation wanted was for the mount to remain inside the glove for storage after it came off display. So as you can see here, how it had been stored, it just had some support put inside, but since we were making a custom-made inner that would fully support this object, it would be good to use that in future for its safety in storage as well. So we have this conflict between the conservation concerns and the display intent. We needed a solid element inside the mount in order to float it, and the shape for fingers I've usually created using just bent acrylic rods. So straight rods, slightly bending them at the finger joints. And as you see here, where it's not possible on historic fragile gloves, the glove ends up looking very static and loses that animation we were hoping to have. So, thinking of solutions, I went back to a mannequin and the articulated limbs which they often have on them, which can sometimes be used to bend elements of the costume once you've got it safely on the mannequin, so you're not having that stress, which is the main point of concern on the glove, of getting the fingers into the glove. You can get it safely in while the elements are straight, and then bend it. Mannequin hands themselves weren't going to work in this, partially because they were either too big, in the case of a modern adult hand, or a lot too small in the case of a child's hand. And also these hands that were usually made out of wood, and if that's something that we want to be using for long-term storage inside an object, that's really not something we want to do. So I then started considering whether it was possible to make a bespoke acrylic hand articulated in order to solve all of these issues. So, in order to make this bespoke articulated mount, I first drew around the glove shape and created these bespoke hinged fingers from acrylic rod that I just cut to the size. To ensure that there were no materials other than acrylic being placed inside this, plus the pad softening that my colleague was going to make, I used thin acrylic rods fixed with acrylic weld as pins in the hinge joints, so it was all acrylic. And I just had extra little hinge joints to fix them onto the palm. I did find it slightly problematic angling the thumb correctly, as that joint's a lot more complicated than fingers. And we ended up, under discussion with conservation, deciding it wasn't really time efficient to take the time to make the thumb work, as the intended position of a sword grip has it quite straight anyway, and that could be achieved through the padding done by conservation. So once I'd made the hand, milled some fixings and passed it on to Roger Morris in textile conservation to pad it up beautifully, and then moved on to the shoe, identifying a couple of points where I could fix into it at the heel in this electrical fixing you can see, and on the toe away from the fragile elements of that split in the metal, and also a slight separation that there was between the sole and upper. I shaped a bit of brass bar to fit these elements, soldered them together, added armatures and softening, and you can see the finished elements of that there. And this is the completed mount, sewing front and back, showing the inside of the glove, and also how those fingers were able to be bent, so we were able to get the fingers on completely straight and then just carefully ease them round with discussion from my colleagues in conservation to decide what was appropriate. This is the mount on display with just a piece of mirrored acrylic bent to form a simple lectern underneath, and showing how you can see both the benign side that would be seen by the audience in the theatre, but also the tricks hidden in behind these elements while on display. And I'd like to thank Simon Sladen, Gaeta Werner, Susanna Fiado, and Roisin Morris for all of their input in this display. And thank you all. That's me and my hand done. Any questions?
Thank you for your talk, Joe. Could you elaborate more on the pins and the sort of hinging, where the flanges hit the palm of the hand, if you will?
Yeah, so I mean, you can possibly see it easiest here. So they're just simple, simple hinge joints. So it's just, I sort of explain it slightly more in the slide, but I figure everyone kind of knows how to make a hinge joint, so it's probably not. So I just sort of, I split each bit of the end of each bit of the rod into three. At one end, I cut out the middle section. At the other end, I cut out the two outer sections. I just rounded them off, and then, like I said, in order to not have the anything other than acrylic in it, I didn't want to have any metal fixings. So I popped the two parts I wanted to fix together in a vise together. I drilled through it with just a little bit of like a 2mm screw, and popped a little bit of 2mm acrylic rod through it, and used acrylic weld, so just a slight dot on the two outer bits. So that fixed the rod to those two outer parts of the hinge, while leaving it the central section freely movable, so we could have a fully acrylic hand.
You just kind of answered my question, but just to reiterate, with the pins that you used within the joint, there was enough tension there that it would stay in place once you bent the fingers?
Yeah, so that was more obtained by having the joint itself quite tight fitting. So I sort of, well, after I'd marked up, I went on the outside of the markup for the internal one, and on the inside. So the central bit was quite tight fitting inside it, and then it was slightly, I sanded it so it's slightly abraded, and so the two slightly abraded pieces of acrylic fitting onto one another created the tension you needed for it to hold in place. And obviously, because it's at its side, it's not actually having to be holding weight under tension. So it didn't need any more than that in order to hold it in place.
Wow, that's really precise. Good job.
So Joe, I have a question. So that mount was going to remain in storage for the glove itself?
Yeah, so, I mean, as you probably saw in the final ones, it did have, my colleague Rasheen made this sort of outer padding to go over it, so it had quite a lot of softening on top of it. This was just sort of the internal bit and was quite significantly smaller than the glove in order to allow there to be the room for that padding. And because it was off-gassed acrylic, it's usually considered to be okay for it to be in storage. I imagine the leather glove is probably more damaging to the metalwork that it's being stored with than the mount.
So you didn't have a concern about weight in terms of storage of the hand being either palm down or palm up? So the acrylic basically was just the skeletonized interior of
I mean,
the padding?
it's actually very light, the acrylic hand, but if there was a concern about that, it could just be, it's got the rod, so it could be mounted hovering for storage if they wanted to. But actually, the metal elements sort of sitting down were a lot heavier than my mount at all, so it already had the sort of weighted elements, and it's a lot better for not allowing the distortion of the glove than what had been done previously. So, I mean, we rarely have a perfect solution, but it's better than a bit of tissue.
Quite good. Quite good. Thank you.
What did you use for a barrier material between the plexi and the glove?
So, as I said, it wasn't actually me that did that. That was my that was Rasheen Morris from Textile Conservation at the V&A. It was the outer part was a Bauman's fabric, so a conservation grade black fabric, and then inside I think she just had some polyester wadding, but unfortunately, as I didn't do that aspect of it, I can't be certain. Hope that helps.
Yes, thanks.
It's a brilliant mount. I want to commend you. But this is kind of a silly question for, did anybody ever like play around with the electrical part of the special effects, like reverse engineer it? Like how exactly did that work? Was the stage electrified?
No, there was no, I mean, you can see after, what is it? It's getting on for 130 years now since it was made. I don't trust a lamp from the 80s, so, and the wires are very frayed. They've actually been disconnected from the shoe, so they're sort of like looped on to give the impression of being connected for display, but they're actually disconnected now to prevent it from being sort of too twisted and to prevent further damage to that wire. And I mean, you can see the mesh on the glove is a bit rusted, so I'm not entirely sure what would happen. I mean, it sounds like it was quite dangerous in the 1880s when it was being used with electricity running through it, because it was, live currents. And I mean, this is at a period where I think it was only like 15 years earlier that somebody developed a iridescent light bulb. So the use of electricity in a sort of normal, personal sort of sense was really early. And I don't think very well controlled or much health and safety involved. So, yeah. Oh, good. That's kind of difficult to say because I started and it was sort of one of the things I was working on in and out of things, which is one of the reasons I was sort of able to do a slightly more complicated mount. It probably took me, I guess, where is it? The sort of the cutting down the fingers and making the articulated fingers, I think took about a day. And then it was about a month later that I managed to get back to it in order to attach them to the palm and then make the other elements, which took a couple more days. So yeah, I guess like 3 days all in all, which, yeah, of my work, but then there was obviously other work going on around it, of other people padding things up and stuff. And like I said, I never quite managed to get my thumb attached. Somewhere in the mount shop.
Hello. On your first slide, it says that you're independent. What is your education background, and do you do this full-time, mount making?
I'm currently not employed at an institution, but I was working at the V&A when I made this. And I have studied archaeology and then conservation. So I have, I guess, a bit of a hodgepodge background. I tend to think about things a bit from a conservation point of view, which I enjoy.
I just want to ask you, because this is a piece of art on itself, and I was just wondering, because it's quite elaborate and it took a lot of work to make. I'm not very experienced in mounting clothing or textiles, but if somebody asked me to do this, I understand you did it because you want to enliven the glove, and that it didn't look very
animation.
rigid. But if somebody would ask me to do it, I think I would take quite some sturdy though soft metal and around it foam, so you can bend it. And what made you decide to take this option?
So the reason for using acrylic rather than, say, like a softer aluminium bar, which is often also used in sort of like limbs of mannequins for exactly that reason, is again back to why I didn't want to use wood. It's because it has to be left inside the object. And generally speaking, we don't want to leave metal elements inside an object, particularly when it's also got metal elements itself, because sometimes if things goes... if there's any connection and things, then that can cause problems, and you don't want there to be any possibility of sort of one galvanizing the corrosion of the other or anything. I guess the other benefit of this was that you don't have to put much pressure on the glove in order to bend it. You could just put a very light sort of bend and it would bend round as much as it wanted, whereas depending on the density of the aluminium, it can sometimes be quite difficult to get it to bend, and often sometimes gives you rather odd extra elbows, which doesn't look too good on display. I hope that answers it.
Thank you, Joe. Very, very cool presentation. We have another London presenter, Lauren Isles, who's a costume mounter at the V&A Museum. We'll talk about getting bums on seats, displaying costumes on seated figures.
Hello everybody. My name is Lauren and I am a textiles conservation specialist for the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Today I've got a short presentation on how I recently developed 2 seated mannequins for 2 different displays. The budgets, time constraints and context were very different for each mannequin, and so I'll explain the processes I undertook for each one. Also, as a quick disclaimer, Kira and I have brought a glossary and some examples of materials we talk about in our presentations, so please ask us about anything afterwards. So, without further ado, please let me introduce you to my first figure, Aubrey Essen Scott. This rather handsome racing car driver once said in an interview that his three loves were, sorry, a bit littler. His three loves were motor racing, boat racing on the Thames, and Savile Row clothing. His beautiful evening ensemble, complete with tails, diamond cufflinks, and a gold toothpick holder, was set to be displayed in the recent exhibition Fashion in Masculinities, alongside a black suit worn by Marlene Dietrich and the famous black YSL suit worn by Claudia Schiffer. However, when we undertook an initial assessment of his outfit, we realised he was really quite tall. How tall? It's hard to know for sure because in most of the images we have of him, he is stood behind a car, leaning over a car, or as you can see here, crashing through a barrier backwards in a car. But his trousers measured just underneath a full Lauren, so we think he was definitely well over 6 foot. He technically would have fitted inside the showcase at his full height, but we simply didn't have a mannequin tall enough. We didn't have any budget to get a fiberglass mannequin extended, and also the curator decided he may look a little out of place with the petite ladies displayed either side of him, and so she asked of him to be casually seated. I therefore decided to build him from scratch by reusing a papier-mâché torso from our stores, along with a spare pair of wire arms with fiberglass hands, and then use Foshape to create his lower torso and legs. This first image shows my initial, very quick mock-up, which broke the whole process down into more manageable pieces and meant that I could easily arrange the pose. Also, I'm sure most of you have heard of Foshape, but if not, I have brought examples with me to pass around. If you aren't familiar, Foshape is a felt-like fabric that can be stitched into and solidifies when heat is applied. So you can create a mold from pretty much anything that can withstand the heat, especially fiberglass mannequins. This is the process we take to replicate limbs using Foshape. First, pinning it around the mannequin whilst it's in its fabric state, marking the stitch lines, and then sewing it into a tube or sock, pull it back onto the figure, and steam heat it to solidify it into shape. I then simply cut down the stitch line to release it from the figure. This is how I made my Foshape foot. To create Aubrey's Foshape legs, I used this old fiberglass mannequin with slightly bent knees from our own stock, and then used strips of plastic boning to quickly lengthen and twist them into the correct pose. I set the shape of the legs by filling in the gaps with strips of rime, and then covered them in a fine layer of wadding and a final protective layer of black jersey. The torso also needed drastic alterations in order to create his fashionable wide chest and narrow waist. I selected a short torso that most closely matched the measurements of his jacket, but had a slightly smaller chest. I then used Foshape to replicate the shoulders, this time attaching them wider at the front to extend his chest, whilst keeping the crossback narrow. The holes in the sides allowed the wire armatures to be securely screwed into the original torso using bespoke brackets made by our museum technician, Eric. Once padded to the correct dimensions, the torso was affixed to the back of the plinth with this bracket, also made by Eric. This allowed the torso to float at the correct height, ready for his bottom half to be attached. I made his waist, hips, and the slight curvature of his bottom from, once again, Foshape, which I covered in black jersey and stitched to the torso at the waist. It's a little difficult to see here, but I kept the crotch hollow and added a small jersey pad loosely filled with wadding, which had a more natural finish than a solid shape. I then attached the legs to the hips using a few strips of cotton tape, which meant that I could easily uncross the legs to dress the trousers. In fact, the lightweight Foshape legs and the crotch pad are the only parts that are resting on the trousers and the plinth, allowing for a great deal of support, but with a very small amount of pressure to the trousers. something that would be tricky to accomplish with a seated, heavy fiberglass mannequin. I set the casual leaning pose using, yes, you guessed it, fuss-shaped arms, which I covered with jersey and stitched to the wide shoulders. To match the fiberglass hands and neck cap, I covered a fuss-shaped neck with foam coat, buffed the surface until it was super smooth, and painted over it using touch-up paint. It made a really cool fiberglass effect, and I've got an example with me here to show you that was made for a previous project by my colleague Lilia. It's actually a bottom, again. The final touches were to add his collar, bow tie, shoes, and of course his diamond cufflinks. And here he is, casually reclining in his display case. I really enjoyed the challenge of creating a mannequin from scratch, and it's quite hard to tell that he isn't just another one of the fiberglass figures that surround him in the exhibition. However, the next figure that I developed was a ready-made seated fiberglass mannequin that I bought directly from a mannequin company, which sounds simple, but it had its own challenges. It's therefore time to introduce you to my other seated figure, Satine. As you can see here, this spectacular costume is worn in the iconic swing scene in Moulin Rouge, which you can still see in live performances on Broadway, the West End, and Australia. We wanted to recreate the theatrical magic of the character's entrance in our temporary display, reimagining musicals. And so, with much trepidation and excitement, the team and I endeavoured to display our costume on a figure that was seated on a swing, suspended from the ceiling on open display. This time, however, I had budget on my side, within reason, and because we were acquiring the full costume, it was agreed that we could purchase a full fiberglass bespoke mannequin that would then transfer to the main theatre and performance gallery on permanent display once the temporary exhibition finished. When perusing through mannequin catalogues for potential Satines, I found this seated version from the Harlequin series by Proportion London, which had a good cross-legged pose and closely matched the measurements of the corset. So this was a great starting point, as the seated aspect was already accomplished, and we didn't need to use our time or budget getting a standing mannequin to sit. We luckily had a standing version of the Harlequin in the studio, which had the same measurements of the seated version, and so I could try the corset and boots on for size before ordering. You can see here, particularly from the last image, that it was a little bit snug, so I was able to liaise with the brilliant team at Proportion for them to make the circumference of the chest, waist, and hips smaller, as well as altering the arm pose to match the reference image. Here are the progress images that Proportion sent. You can see how they changed the size and position of the bust and took sections out of the back and hips to meet the measurements that I sent to them, as well as to create the bend in the arms. I was able to visit their workshop at this point to check out the progress in person, rather than over the phone and emails, which was really lovely. Lastly, in order to get the correct fit for the boots, I tried them on a spare pair of Harlequin legs that we had kicking about in the studio, onto which I directly marked the necessary alterations. I then sent the legs to Proportion, who were able to replicate the cut lines directly onto our sateen. The image on the right is the final rendition before she was painted, and she's actually so well balanced, she's simply sitting on the chair without needing a fixing, although she is affixed onto the display plinth with a spigot. The image on the left is when she arrived at the Textiles Conservation Studio. The corset and the boots fitted wonderfully. I added a jersey barrier to the torso and padded the bust a little bit to support the bust cups, but other than that, she was ready to be dressed and take her place in the exhibition. And here she is in the display. So I didn't have quite as much to talk about with Satine as I did for Aubrey, because the production team at Proportion did all of the shaping. But I was responsible for clearly communicating to them the accurate measurements and specific points of alteration, which I was able to identify using my knowledge of garment construction and experience in costume mounting. I really love creating dynamic figures and believe that even the slightest alteration to the pose can make a big difference. For example, the actress who wore this costume in the musical Chorus Line in 1977 came to see her outfit in Reimagining Musicals last week and emailed to say that we brought her costume to life again. And that was simply by posing her arm with the hat like it is in the reference image. Her words really meant a lot, and looking forward, I'm hoping to develop more techniques in bringing costumes to life using dynamic posing. I would also love to know if you have any techniques that could help me in my future mounts. Thank you.
So I have a question with the dynamic poses, particularly the last one that you showed. Did you have any issues as far as having the body form stand up on its own? How are you keeping it on display?
It looks like magic, doesn't it? So the spigot is, so we have, when the mannequins arrive, they arrive on base plates with the spigot attached. And I particularly love using simply spigots that are drilled into the display plinths. So the foot or sometimes the calf is where the spigot is locked into. And that creates a bit more of a freestanding style.
So does it go through the foot or the shoe?
It goes through the foot. So that in the last image, the shoes are prop shoes, so we have a hole in the shoes. But in the same display, we had another costume from the musical Six, which has object boots, and so we use a calf spigot. So it's a little bit further up, but the calf spigot is drilled into the display plinth and goes into the leg of the mannequin, and that's the point which it's affixed to the plinth.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
We have a question from our virtual audience. How is the decision made to go headless on mannequins?
Headless?
Yeah, without a head.
Oh, it's a design choice quite often. Usually we display things with heads when there's an object to display, like a hat or something. It's a long discussion at the beginning of the design for the exhibition, whether we have heads or wigs. And yeah, it's usually a design choice for a designer or a curator.
We have another virtual question. How long are each of the costumes generally on display?
It depends what if it's for a temporary display, so it's usually about a year for temporary display, and even permanent display with costume, it's about 5, at the most maybe 10 years. It depends on rotations and on the permanent displays.
Thank you. Beautiful job.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I was just wondering how the hat was supported in the last image.
Yeah, it's really cool. My colleague Toby made the mount for the hat, and he'd be able to explain it in a much better way than I do. But he created a small wire mount that's drilled into the hand, and the wire attaches to a perspex disc that sits inside the brim, the top of the hat. And the fact that it's perspex is also great because you can look up inside the hat and see the wearer's name, which was biroed in. by the wardrobe team for chorus line. So you can see her name inside the mount, which is lovely. And there's also, because it's held up and the wire goes into the hat itself, but there's also a very small bracket that sits on top of the brim of the hat, just keeping everything in place. And that's a particularly nice mount, that one. Very clever.
Do you know what the substance is that was put on the mannequin, the seated dancer mannequin? What did you coat that with after it was modified, before it was painted?
It's a fiberglass mannequin, and it was painted using a royal paint. I don't know the chemicals ins and outs of the painting, but it's spray painted.
Sorry for my Yankee question, but is Perspex like a British plexiglass brand name? Or I heard you guys say it, and I also heard the first presentation say it.
Acrylic.
Okay, very good, thank you.
Like crisps and chips.
Lauren, I have the sample of the bum. I think this is the bum, right?
Yeah.
So I noticed it's foss shape, and then it has a fabric edge, and then what's the gray? Is that paint?
That's the foam coat. So we apply, it's like a thick paste that we apply over and then buff it. And once it's buffed, it creates a really smooth surface. And when we use the same touch-up paint that the mannequins are sprayed with, it looks just like the fiberglass. It's a really clever thing.
Yeah, this is nice.
It will be explained a little bit more in the next little bit, the painting.
Do you know if it's been Audi tested?
The foam coat?
The foam coat.
I guess so. Yeah, I think so. I don't know for sure, but we Audi test literally everything over and over.
Yeah, so, sorry, I have a virtual question as well from our virtual audience. She asks, how do you attach the padding to the mannequin?
It's stitched into. So if there's a fiberglass mannequin that we're covering in wadding, we always make a jersey cover, something that we can stitch into. And if it's a papier-mâché torso, we can stitch straight into it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about how the seated mannequin is fastened to the swing itself to keep it from pivoting or anything like that?
Yeah, so in the same way that standing mannequins have a foot spigot or a calf spigot, the mannequin company created a spigot hole in the side of her leg, and that spigot is about this big, and that is drilled directly into the swing. So she's lifted onto the swing, and that's how she stays put. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lauren. Another great presentation from the V&A. And we're fortunate we have one more from the V&A, which is fantastic. Kiara Miller, who is a senior conservator in textile display, will talk about a K-pop pose for tiny clothes, next level foss shape.
Hello everybody, I'm Kiara. I'm a costume display specialist at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it's a true pleasure to be presenting this talk, A K-pop Pose for Tiny Clothes, hot on the heels of my V&A friends, Joe and Lauren. And I'm only sorry to everybody else that we appear to have brought the British weather with us. So a great thing about working at the V&A is there are always a million things going on at once. So while theatrical tricks and musicals fascinate visitors in the theatre galleries, Yet another gallery is awash with Korean culture, thanks to the recently opened exhibition, Hallyu, the Korean Wave. Tracking South Korea's rapid evolution from war-torn nation of the 1950s to the global powerhouse it is today, the exhibition takes a close look at the sweeping phenomenon of Hallyu and how the world is falling for South Korea's exports of phones, film, food, fashion, beauty products, and most importantly for this presentation, pop music. Before I go too much further, I have to confess that when I began this project, my knowledge of K-pop pretty much started and ended with a passable ability to dance along to Psy's 2012 hit Gangnam Style. But even I'd begun to notice that K-pop is having a moment, with idols attracting attention and headlines worldwide. BTS visited the White House earlier this year, speaking out against Asian-directed hate crime, while Blackpink are rapidly chasing the title of biggest girl group in the world, following huge interest in their Netflix documentary. For those of you yet to catch the K-pop bug, K-pop is generally characterized as a genre that mixes a number of different music styles, including pop, rap, and hip-hop, with performances often including rigorous synchronized dance routines and visually impressive outfits, as you'll soon see. In the decades since the aforementioned Gangnam Style became the first video to top 1 million views on YouTube, K-pop has continued to attract huge fan bases globally, thanks to spectacular stage shows, frenetic and highly stylized videos, and an extraordinary output on social media. But with neither of the K-pop bands I'd heard of lending to the exhibition, I was gifted the opportunity to dive a little deeper into the world of K-pop and get to know a few more of its idols. While G-Dragon is my new all-time favorite, today I'm going to be talking about garments worn by four-piece girl group aespa in their Next Level video, and how I went about bringing some attitude to their mannequins. Now I'm going to show you just a short taster clip here so you can get an idea of what was coming my way.
I'm on the next level, yeah. 절대적 룰을 지켜 내 손을 놓지 마라. 결속은 나의 무기. 광야로 걸어가 알아 내 home ground. 위협에 맞서서 제껴라 제껴라 제껴라.
To pause that video. But hopefully that was enough to get you all hooked on K-pop. Let's see if we can move this along. Oopsie, that's not what I wanted to do. So the girls wear at least 5 different outfits each in this video. And it was extremely late in the planning process when we discovered we would be borrowing these garments as worn at the opening of the video. Despite being sent a handful of photos, the measurements we received related to the physical space the garments inhabited when laid flat, rather than dimensions relating to how they might fit onto a body. With half of the textile objects arriving less than 4 weeks before installation, I didn't have the luxury of being able to order figures to fit the garments, as might be our standard practice. Instead, I needed to start thinking of an educated guess at sizes, probably super slim and not too tall, while keeping in mind the curator's specific desire not to have straight, unposed figures. And of course, the only fiberglass figures available in a small enough size were exactly what the curator didn't want: straight and unposed. Traditionally, this need not be a problem, since we often work with mannequin manufacturers to break and reshape figures to achieve the poses we need, as Lauren has so beautifully explained, and as you can see in this example from the Mary Quant exhibition. However, this process is time-consuming and generally requires accurate toiles or object replicas. With the objects arriving so late, this sadly wasn't an option. Another option might have been to custom build figures from Foss shape, as we did for this cycling outfit for V&A Dundee. But you'll see in this example that we opted for a cutaway finish, since the texture of Foss shape isn't visually appealing as a substitute for skin. And as you will have seen, these K-pop costumes certainly show off an awful lot of skin. So what kept coming to mind as I mulled this over was a technique previously used by NMAI and the V&A, and explained by Lauren, that of coating Foss shape in foam coat before sanding and smoothing it to a fiberglass-like texture. Here you can see the technique used to great effect to disguise a hip join and create a more rounded derriere for the undressed exhibition. And I'm sure you will have spotted this is exactly the same buttock that Lauren passed around as a sample. So hopefully some of you have seen it already, and those who haven't, it's coming your way. With less than 4 weeks to mount 30 complex costumes, most of which we'd never seen, there just wasn't going to be time to treat full figures in this way. If only there was a way of achieving something similar, but a bit faster. Having found out what the objects were so late, the only figures that were small enough and available in the remaining time were our trusty papier-mâché workroom figures. We decided to use a satin top fabric cover on those to more closely match the colour of the fiberglass figures in the rest of the exhibition. And by adding articulated arms, we knew we could achieve some amount of posing in the upper body, but the challenge remained what to do about the legs. What if I could find someone else who could do the coating? Just a few weeks in advance of the objects arriving, I sent a Foss-shaped leg off to the studio of mannequin manufacturers Universal Display. And this is what came back. So this is a Foss-shaped leg coated in polyester resin. While not instantly appealing, we've affectionately been calling this the snot leg, the finely finished areas had exactly what I was looking for, the smooth finish of fiberglass. With Adrian at Universal reassuring me that the fine finish could be achieved throughout, and that it could be spray painted just like ordinary fiberglass, I decided to take a gamble. And this is where I get to add to the circulating samples, as I brought along the arm prototype which accompanied the leg. Sadly, there wasn't quite enough time to take this approach for each of the girls, nor could my nerves have handled it if the gamble hadn't paid off 4 times over. Instead, we started looking at poses where we could compromise. Using the pose in the centre as inspiration, but switching the girls around slightly, we decided the 2 outfits with trousers would have standard Foss-shaped legs, since they would largely be hidden, and Giselle could have straight fiberglass legs, leaving Winter in need of some experimental resin Foss legs. Acting swiftly once the objects arrived at the museum, standard Foss-shaped legs were made for Winter, using an existing fiberglass mannequin as a mould. And a leg pose that worked with the garments was established. And at this point, I have to thank Lauren for so beautifully demonstrating how this technique works. To achieve the pose, Winter's right leg was slightly altered to give more definition to the knee bend. This was done by cutting the Foss shape and reattaching it in a slightly different position with stitching and hot melt glue. Both her torso and legs were marked with coloured stitching, so the correct pose could be recreated once the legs came back. I chose to leave the top and bottom edges of the legs uncoated, since this would allow the legs to be stitched to the torso, while leaving the lower leg supple enough to be inserted into the object boots. So here you can see the uncoated Foss-shaped legs on the left, being marked for a pose alteration, and on the right, the same pair of legs, but coated and painted as they came back from Universal, which happened within the space of a week, so much faster than the standard break and reshape approach. So here are a few more images of the legs being attached to the torso and covered in the satin top fabric. You may notice that the incredibly small and see-through nature of the shorts, coupled with the slightly wider leg stance, made this a bit of a logistical nightmare. One leg had to remain detached until the shorts were almost in position, with the satin fabric being stitched down while the shorts were awkwardly stretched across the thighs. And it's possibly worth noting at this point that were I to do this again, I don't think I would opt to have the uncoated foss shape areas painted to match the coated areas. This was a bit of a gamble, and I had hoped it might save me some precious time and help blend the join beneath the see-through hot pants. But the fabric of the hot pants really caught on the painted surface, so the foss shape areas ended up being covered anyway, and the painted finish made the legs slightly harder to stitch into than I might have liked. Finally, of course, the whole figure needed to stand up. With object boots denying us the option for a foot spigot and the hot pants in the way of the torso's bust runner, our remaining option was to build a cantilevered bracket system connecting to the mannequin torso. Screwed to the torso, the metal brackets clamp the papier-mâché of the torso, with the extending rod slotting neatly into a fixing, which then sits inside a standard mannequin pole. Thankfully, I didn't have to do this bit because we really were running out of time, and this was fabricated by our in-house project technician, James McNeff. So just to finish off, here are all four of Esper, all displayed on the same type of torso, but Ning Ning and Karina have foss-shaped legs, Giselle has fiberglass legs, and of course we have Winter with her hybrid resin foss fiberglass look legs, which did end up looking exactly like fiberglass. Thank you for listening. I look forward to your questions. I just want to quickly say thank you to these lovely people for their support throughout the project, which I'm doing with the help of Sai, who is also in the exhibition. I'm going to try and say this bit without welling up. No, I'm not going to manage it. Having spent the last 6 months immersed in Korean culture, I'd like to end by saying that my heart really goes out to everyone affected by the recent tragedy in Seoul. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk, Kira. Can you tell me what, oh my gosh, I abbreviated the question. So you said the painted legs had to be covered. What were they covered with?
So they were covered with, so the torsos are each covered in the visible parts of the torso are covered in a satin fabric, which was a similar colour to the fiberglass. Underneath that, there's a layer of cotton jersey, which is the barrier layer between the polyester wadding and the object. So the top parts of the legs were covered with a layer of jersey, and then over the top of that, there was also the satin top fabric. With a different object, that might not be absolutely vital, but it was because the hot pants were see-through, and I needed to find a way of blending the colour, essentially.
I'm guessing that didn't add much to the girth. It's thin enough.
It was just about thin enough. I think in future, I would probably, when I was hardening the foss shape, I think I would try to get a slightly finer or flatter edge, just as a way of kind of buying more space for different layering that you might need to do. It was very, very experimental and done incredibly quickly.
It looks great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So I had a question. So besides your working mannequins, do you keep a large stock of posable mannequins, or do you work from a case-by-case basis in terms of display?
We do have a running stock of mannequins, and the mannequin store is it's my baby, really, although it's slightly messy at the moment. So we try to focus on keeping well, keeping less and reusing more. So we focus on keeping mannequins that we can reuse for as many things as possible. When we overhauled our store a few years ago, we found that there were lots of very bespoke mannequins that had been made or adapted for very specific objects, but then had languished in the mannequin store for over a decade. And of course, whenever they kind of come up again, those objects come up again, that's not the type of mannequin that's wanted, because design kind of choices have moved on. So we do tend to focus on keeping things that could be adapted for a number of different things. That's not to say that projects don't come up where, as Lauren explained so beautifully with sateen, we need something that is very much bespoke. The hope would then be that those things would move maybe from a temporary display into a permanent gallery at some point. If you ever want to come and visit the mannequin store, I love doing tours.
We have a question from our virtual audience. It's about the fabric, actually. So was the satin fabric a woven fabric or a knit fabric?
It's a woven fabric, but it is a woven fabric with an amount of stretch to it. And I'm really sorry that that's a virtual question, because I did bring a sample with me in case anybody really wanted to have a look at it. But I'm very happy if anyone wants to email me and I can pass on the supplier details. The fabric was slightly hard won because Brexit has made it very difficult for us to buy things from Europe. So I have tons of it as well if anybody needs any.
So to continue, if it's woven, was it used on the bias?
Yes, it
Excellent.
was. Yeah,
right. And then what is the fiber content of the satin fabric?
I think it would be worth emailing me about that, because I can absolutely tell you. I just don't have that information on the top of my head.
And it's a conservator, so I'll email her.
Yeah,
and include you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm happy to share the supplier details with that as well.
Also, thank you to all three of you for passing around the samples. These are really, really nice.
The buttock's made its way back, I see.
Yeah, it's perfect, but it's perfect. Yeah, it's a perfect thing because, you know, you can see the picture, but to actually feel the thing is really important.
We may be getting close to releasing everybody for lunch. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiera. That was an amazing presentation. So we've reached the end of our morning session, and lunch is ready. I had a couple things real quickly I wanted to bring up. Anybody who drove today, we now have our parking validation set up at the registration table, so please make sure you bring your parking ticket and get it stamped there sometime today. Also, just because of the weather, lunch is going to be a little tricky with seating. We've tried to accommodate as many people as we can under cover. So there is going to be, there's the tables inside. There are the standing tables. There are seating areas that are on the tram level. So if you go down the stairwell or out through the front, if you go down to the level where the tram is, you'll see tables that are under cover. We apologize for this, but it's what we're going to have to work with today. Hopefully tomorrow will be better. And also the last thing is if the afternoon presenters could come up to the podium before they go to lunch so they can check in and make sure their presentations are all set. Great. Well, thank you, everyone. See you soon. We'll see you at 1 o'clock.